Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bertin M. Louis Jr. I am President-elect of the Association of Black Anthropologists, an Associate Professor of Anthropology and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. I'm the moderator for today's event, and I welcome you to what will be an important and stimulating discussion. Although anthropology is often perceived primarily as an academic discipline, Black anthropologists have had a more complex relationship with the discipline and with the ivory tower more generally. Anthropologists like Zora Neale Hurston, Catherine Dunham, and others, who were always already part of the communities in which they did their research, recognize while anthropologists often had contentious relationships with their communities, the discipline offered a set of analytical tools which, in the right hands and in the right context, were invaluable for parsing issues that touch their communities, including race, racism, Blackness, health and educational disparities, and equitable access to material and cultural resources. The legacy of Black professional anthropologists working outside of academia spans many decades in many sectors. Today, hundreds of anthropologists hold full-time positions that allow them to apply their expertise in governmental agencies, nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, private corporations, and international bodies. These anthropologists recognize that they hold critical tools for problem solving and addressing social justice issues. In recognition of the deep legacy of applied anthropology among members of the Association of Black Anthropologists, this roundtable will discuss the varied paths that our panelists, members of the ABA, took to becoming practicing anthropologists and the breadth of types of work they do. Panelists will discuss how their identity as Black anthropologists has shaped their career choices, perspectives, experiences, and analyses. Now, before I introduce the members of our distinguished roundtable, I would like to discuss the ground rules for today's event. Please be sure your microphones are muted and stop your cameras during the discussion period. You're welcome to write questions in the chat feature of Zoom. I'd also like to mention that we have a Spotify playlist and a drink recipe for this special event. You'll find both of those will be dropped into the chat. And then also there's a link that will be dropped in the chat to the Association of Black Anthropologists YouTube channel, as we'll have create more content that will be on the YouTube channel in the near future. And if you do click on this link, be sure to subscribe, okay? Now a little bit about the format. I'm gonna ask a question that each roundtable member will answer. I'll have up to 3 minutes to respond. We'll have up to an hour of discussion, and the rest of the time of this event will be devoted to questions from the audience with answers from our guests. Now let me introduce our panelists. Giles Harrison-Conwill, Ph.D. is a UX researcher and anthropologist who brings human-centered insights into perspectives for teams of designers, product managers, and engineers who collaboratively develop software products. Dr. Harrison-Conwill works on communication products at Google. An anthropologist by training, he addresses business and design challenges with human-centered strategies grounded in social science theory and practice. Through user and consumer research, Dr. Harrison-Conwill provides direction for product and brand innovation and draws on his background in anthropology and ethnography to provide actionable insights for brand strategy and product design. Applying anthropological methods in industry research, Giles has spent nearly 10 years examining and translating messy human experiences in design and marketing organizations. Today, he leads teams that utilizes research to build inclusive products that are widely available and ultimately add value to users' lives. Teresa Leslie, PhD, is a scientist, community engagement specialist, and educator. In addition to her published research investigating the interaction and delicate balance between people, the environment, animals, and pathogens, Dr. Leslie has authored books and articles that examine the interrelationship between racism and classism, public, global health inequity, and sustainable community development in both national and international contexts. From 2007 to 2013, she worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Naval Medical Research Center Viral and Rickettsial Disease Department, Infectious Disease Directorate in Silver Spring, Maryland. While living abroad, Dr. Leslie worked for 8 years as director of the Eastern Caribbean Public Health Foundation and served for 5 years as president of the board of a local environmental conservation organization, STENAPA, and advised the public health and agricultural sectors. Upon returning to the United States, she worked as the director of public health research at EcoRay and was a Senior Educational Development Specialist at Central Maryland AHEC. She currently works at the International Vaccine Access Center at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. Tracy R. Rone, Ph.D., is Interim Director of Innovation and Community Partnerships and Associate Professor in the Department of Advanced Studies, Leadership and Policy in the School of Education and Urban Studies at Morgan State University. She previously served as Research Associate Professor at the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University, where she also taught undergraduate and graduate courses in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. She is trained as a linguistic anthropologist. Her research aims to illuminate urban education issues in high poverty, resource-challenged contexts through an anthropological lens. She's especially interested in how identity informs academic performance, the intersection of health and educational disparities, and how narrative can be used to illuminate lived experiences in urban communities. She has served as research co-director for the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, a partnership of Baltimore City Public Schools, Morgan State University, and Johns Hopkins University. Her publications explore issues in urban poverty, narrative, African-American academic success, and strategies for creating civic and intellectual engagement in undergraduate classrooms. She published in College Teaching and Transforming Anthropology. She earned a Ph.D. from the University of California, Los Angeles. And last but not least is Michel Tinguiri, Ph.D. He is a cultural anthropologist, a linguist, and a translator of French, English, and Spanish. As a contractor at the International Center for Language Studies, Michel has been teaching French language and Francophone cultures at the Foreign Service Institute, which is part of the Department of State. Michel is also a part-time instructor in cultural anthropology at Montgomery College in Maryland. His interests include language and culture, urbanization, gender and development, displacement and resettlement, project management, international migration, security in the Sahel, and instructional and educational technology. He received his Ph.D. in cultural anthropology from the American University in Washington, D.C. in 2013. He published a novel titled The Tribulations of a Sahelian Traveler, the Sahel Nomad Books in 2014, and a collection of poems, La Parole, Muette et les Échos de la Justice, Mute Speech and the Echoes of Justice with Eder Livre in 2017. His recent collaborative research project includes the experience of African migrant teachers in US schools. He's also been working on an article titled Linguistic Boundaries of Representation in Americana, a novel by Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, and an unpublished novel titled Souls in a Birding City, and the collection of poems L'ère de l'errance au pays, the era of drift in the country. In his spare time, Michel also explores everyday life in the environment through drawing, landscape, and portraiture. All right, folks. So I'm going to ask our participants a series of questions. And before I ask the first question, I'm going to ask you to please say your name and also describe what you're yourself, what you're wearing, things of that nature. My name is Bertin Louis. I am a middle-aged, dark-skinned Black man with salt and pepper dreadlocks, and I'm wearing a black shirt. With the first question, I'm going to ask this question, and we're going to go in alphabetical order this time. So we'll start with Dr. Harrison-Conwill. In what ways has your identity as a Black anthropologist, if that is how you define yourself, shaped your career choices, the way you approach your work, including perhaps which work you take on, and the kind of deliverables that you produce?
So, hi everyone. Quickly, a description. I am, I suppose at this point, I'm middle-aged. I'm a middle-aged anthropologist. I identify as a Black man. I have dreadlocks. I'm wearing glasses, I'm wearing a blue shirt, and I have a blurry background behind me. But back there is a wonderful backyard in Florida. In terms of the question, I do identify as a Black anthropologist, but I would say that is, I think about the sort of concentric circles of identity. So I'm a Black anthropologist, but I'm also a UX researcher. At times, I've been a consumer researcher. I consider myself a design practitioner, among other things. One of the things, of course, that sort of I would say about identity And the work that I've come to do is that absolutely, I would say my identity and my affinities have played some role in the choices that I've made about the types of projects that I work on, the types of groups that I choose to work with. And of course, the way that I attempt to do the job in the day-to-day. So to some degree, that is to say that I find that I am sensitive to certain types of questions, certain types of concerns that maybe others in my organizations might not be thinking about. And a lot of that has to do with me drawing upon my own background, both as someone who's conducted field research in specific places in the world, who's thought about certain topics, but also, when I think about things like the deliverables, I really think of those as artifacts in a way that I would think that many anthropologists probably do as well. And those artifacts do things. And I also really try to think about like what I want those artifacts to do. And so to some degree, I attempt to create artifacts that are one, doing the sort of core work that I have to do in the day-to-day, which is convince people to make certain types of decisions that can lead to better products, services, and processes. But also, I'm thinking about things like creating a welcoming space for specific types of thinkers, specific types of researchers, specific types of colleagues. Part of that means creating a space for, at times, people of color. Some of the times it's about making sure it's a space where people who maybe just don't feel as though they are the folks that are the norm within these organizations. So that could be about disability. It could be about some other aspect of identity, but really trying to think about how the deliverable can accomplish the core job while also sending signals, smoke signals to some degree to potential hires, to teammates that might want to collaborate. So sort of thinking through identity and trying to match it to opportunity, both within my team and beyond it.
Next, can we have Dr. Leslie?
Good evening, everyone. It's a lot of questions, very packed. First, let me say that, again, my name is Teresa. I would consider myself a light-skinned African-American woman. I'm wearing a blue shirt. I now wear glasses because I'm middle-aged. And I have this beautiful exposed brick wall behind me, which I love, something that I very much love in design, in these old buildings, the actual exposed brick. I think being African-American is a totally different experience than some other people. So as for me, I think that I went into anthropology to a certain extent because it seemed to pretend, well, I would say mainly because a lot of the content I saw was just ultimately racist. And so I chose the discipline because it excited me. This is something that I have a voice. Do I consider myself a Black anthropologist? Of course I do, but I would also say that out there in the world, I find that people, especially in my field, which is public health, they don't distinguish between the different social sciences. So I kind of just see myself as an African-American social scientist. And a lot of my work, I've worked very hard up until this point, but a lot of my work is always dedicated to the empowerment of people of color. And I've worked nationally and I've worked internationally, and I've seen that it doesn't matter where you are. It seems like people of African descent in many different contexts are just not empowered. So therefore, I currently work because I've dealt with infectious diseases before, I currently work for the International Vaccine Access Center, which is at Johns Hopkins, on a project called the Value Project. And before I was talking, I was like, wow, I should know what that stands for because it's very long. But basically what it is a very human-centered approach to encouraging people to get vaccinated for COVID-19. So it's very important work. And in Baltimore, if you know anything about Baltimore, if you've been to Baltimore, probably you haven't seen the areas that to a certain extent look like war zones. And therefore it's my job to lead a team or to encourage a team to go into these areas and provide people who are very distrustful and where there's a significant fear factor to how to talk to people, how to build trust. And I must say that my training as an anthropologist has enabled me to do that in a very, very medically dominated world, because I think of things and pull things together that they can't. But my ultimate deliverable is to empower people to make healthcare decisions based on what they know, not based on what I or somebody tells them.
So much, Dr. Leslie. Next, can we have Dr. Rone, please?
Good evening. My name is Tracy Rone. I am a middle-aged African-American woman. I'm wearing glasses that should be bifocals. I have curly hair and I'm wearing a copper-colored short sleeve blouse. And behind me is just a cream or white double door. So I would say that as a Black anthropologist, I identify as a Black anthropologist. I grew up in Baltimore. I'm a native of Baltimore. Baltimore has one of the oldest race-based housing covenants in the country, and the legacy of the war zones that Teresa described are the legacy, in part, from the housing policy and the policies and practices that were reinforced for a very long time, for decades. I grew up in part on the campus of Morgan State University and returned to Morgan in 2007 to work at the Institute for Urban Research. And that institute's primary role is to address the issues, whether it's transportation, housing, education, health, the disparities that impact largely Black residents in the city, to a lesser extent, lower income white residents of the city as well. So I see my identity as a Black person, as a native of Baltimore, as really influencing the choice to come back and work at Morgan, the choice to come back to the city that really inspired me to want to make a difference and to want to make changes in this environment. In terms of deliverables, whether the deliverables are a process, so how can we refine the processes that parents that need to go through, parents and caregivers need to go through with various issues in schools? How do we take, instead of producing another report that sits on a shelf, how can we take what families tell us about what they need to create products that families can then use to help their children be successful? So those are the kinds of deliverables that I think about and I use in my work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rone. Finally, Dr. Tangiri.
Great. Good evening, everybody. My name is Michel Tangiri. I'm a Black male, middle-aged, dark skin, and I'm wearing a blue jacket and and also a blue shirt. Behind me, you can see a library, and I'm sitting in a chair that is covered by, with an African, bogolan cloth with some African design, black and white stripes and some brown, background. So yes, I do consider myself as a Black anthropologist. If that question was asked to, if I was asked this, the same question somewhere maybe in Burkina Faso, I would probably introduce myself differently. So which implies that in fact, self-portraiture is a matter of space and time and the circumstances where you find yourself. So I grew up in Burkina Faso, and then, I was able to be exposed to different, spaces, and also I, discovered more about, African history and African, identity debates and discussions through African literature. And for example, writers like Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Leon Contrast Damas, Leopold Sedar Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and so on and so forth. These are the people that really informed my understanding of, my identity through, for example, the negritude movement that really dominated at that time, the African continent. And even today, the conversation is still ongoing. So my identity indeed is, complex and nuanced. And, drawing, for example, from painting, I would say that self-portraiture is not that easy. Which color, for example, should I choose? And how should I mix the colors, from literature, translation studies, linguistics, from Burkina Faso to the United States, and so on and so forth. How do I mix the colors in order to, portray myself, define myself, in order to be visible and maybe legible and also readable? And how do I project that self? So into different spaces, is really very important. So I work as a language and culture trainer at the Foreign Service Institute, I've been working there. So through, of course, the International Language Center, I'm a contractor. So I engage, for example, with policymakers, decision makers, and I try to empower them and enlighten their, approach to the issue, for example, of development, of politics, of democracy, of diversity, of social justice, of socio-economic development, and so on and so forth, through language. Because language is really a very important tool, to engage other people. It allows us to build bridges. It allows us, for example, to, understand each other. It allows us to, be tolerant. It allows us to be open-minded. So when you master language, when you master a culture, you develop certain kind of awareness, cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, and how you can connect with the local people in different places, in different spaces. So how can you read, for example, faces? So this might be maybe somehow, it may sound like a little abstract, but this is very important and central in policy, implementation in different parts of the world. How do you read, for example, the air through language, through culture? How do you read the faces of places and spaces that are different from the spaces that you see, for example, here in the United States? I think that's very important. And as a cultural, anthropologist, as a linguist, I try to empower, for example, US government workers, maybe diplomats, and deputy chief of missions, ambassadors, and so on and so forth in their mission, abroad. So I'll stop there for the time being.
So much, Dr. Tangiri. All right, let's move on to the next question for the panel. Can you reflect on your own positionality in the communities with which you work? Do you work with communities in which you consider yourself a member? Do your experiences as a person of color shape your interactions with the people in the communities you work with and the interventions you offer? Can we start with Dr. Leslie, please?
Yes. That's an interesting question, because it's not just a question of me feeling I'm a member of a community, but being accepted by those communities that I work with. As an anthropologist, as a scientist, as somebody with a Ph.D., as somebody who's working from at Hopkins, that has a terrible reputation for their, if you want to call it, experimentation with the community that's there. Most people know about the HeLa cells, Henrietta Lacks, the cell line that was a different time, but were taken and used without permission. So a lot of times it's, I just, as an individual, although I may feel some connection to a group of people, ultimately I've experienced not being accepted. Even though I come in as somebody, hey, we have so much in common, sometimes you're actually not accepted by the community and treated like any other outsider. So because of my commitment, what I tend to do is work with a lot of community-based organizations that are already embedded within communities. And I wouldn't say use those, I would say partner with those community-based organizations and people working with those organizations. It could be faith-based, it could be any number of things to enter into a community. And because I'm in charge of people, actually, at this point in my career, I love to come, we should have something on the anthropology of middle age. I don't even know what that means, middle age. So, but I figured everybody else was using it, so I should also. But that tends to be what I do, because there are differences. I grew up in a very different type of situation that I see in a lot of these communities in Baltimore. So to a certain extent, from that perspective, from a socioeconomic perspective, I'm very much different from those communities that I work so hard to serve. But I think that, and I do want to tell you the name of the program, I found it, the value program is Vaccine and Access, Lives in Unity, Engagement, and Education. And what I found interesting about this job is this is like the first time in my life, really, now middle-aged, where I have been put in charge of changing the strategy for this value project to focus on those neighborhoods that have the lowest rates of vaccination. So, and I'm just like, you want me to, and they're giving me the permission to really push this through. So of course it's not, I've been working for this pretty much all my life because I've been prevented from doing it. But I think that because of the legacy of everybody, all the anthropologists, all the scientists, all those African Americans, no matter who they were, have pushed so hard that we've gotten to this point where now they're really seeing that their racism, the structural systemic racism that has destroyed this city to a certain extent, they're giving me access to kind of the freedom to do what I want, because it's very important that we get people vaccinated, because you're talking about a whole different form of discrimination if you have a lot of people who are not vaccinated. There's a long way to go in this pandemic. So again, I'm going to stop there so other people can share as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rone, you go next, please.
Okay, thank you. So Baltimore is a city that is about a little over 90 square miles. So it's not a small city. It feels more like a town in the sense that people are connected and people know each other. But it's also a city with, I think, about 12 universities within the city proper and the surrounding counties. So there is a sense, particularly among Black people, that they're always under the microscope and always being studied. And often the white researchers who are conducting the research, they get their data and they don't come back. They don't come back to share information. They don't come back to help make things better. And so there is a sense among African-American community activists that white researchers, and I will, there is some particular tension around Johns Hopkins as a university, that there is a tremendous wealth made off the backs of poor Black people. And that has been the history of the city and the history of the relationship of Johns Hopkins to Black residents. So given that background and that context, when I show up as a Black woman from Morgan State University, which is the largest HBCU in the state, we have two HBCUs in the city of Baltimore, Coppin and Morgan. There is typically and generally a sense of relief. However, because Morgan is a state institution, sometimes there is some mistrust that I have to navigate. I will say that that as a Black researcher, I typically, the sense of relief is you will hear me, that participants think or community members think that I will hear them, that I will understand what they're saying, I will understand where they're coming from. Even at Morgan, we had we still have a community project, engagement project. And Baltimore is a city that was settled in ethnic enclaves, and many of the names of the neighborhoods had names that over time were perceived as derogatory. And so the city's Office of Planning collapsed the neighborhoods and gave them new names. And the problem, so we use something called a community statistical area, CSA, which is germane to Baltimore as a measure of geographic space. And so we had some of my colleagues show up at a meeting with the maps that are scientifically, they've been defined using the science of GIS and the policy of the city. And the residents were up in arms because these are not our boundaries. This is not, the boundary is over there. And so because I am local, I'm able to understand, I know what they mean and how they're interpreting what that map looks like. So something, these representations of something like a map or messaging that's intended for community members, I often, because of the trust I have, the relational trust I have with the local community, am able to understand maybe what might work better, or understand why communities resist what often the scientists try and the policymakers try to push onto residents.
Dr. Tinguiri. Michel.
Great. Oh, all right. Thank you very much indeed. So, because I work in spaces, where I have to engage with people who have developed, a habit of leading, and of course, who are going to be, in places where they may not necessarily be aware of certain nuances in terms of, the cultural norms and standards and expectations and so on and so forth. So I have to, always draw their attention to the power that is embedded in language, the power that is behind language. It's really very important that certain, terms that you can use very easily in English, if you're going to use them, for example, in French, you're going to create a lot of problems. For example, you can say indigenous people in English, there's no problem. You can say indigenous people. But now if you go to Francophone Africa, you say indigenous people in French, you're going to shock people who are really aware of the history behind the term indigenous people in French, which means primitive, literally, which means backward people. So it's really very important to draw their awareness, on these type of issues, and in order to empower them and enlighten them in decision making and in engaging with their local, partners and counterparts once they're posted, for example, overseas. So how do you navigate that kind of space where, people maybe at first they would say, oh, you are teaching a language which is not yours, for example. You say you're teaching French, French is not your language. And people who are, in search of, the notion of pure, linguistic ideology really comes into the picture in the conversation, and you have to figure out a way to position yourself in order to help the learner achieve his or her goals in terms of understanding the language and being able to deploy that language as a tool of communication, as a tool of dialogue, as a tool of, to build bridges, to achieve a socio-economic development, for example, if you're working with USAID and so on and so forth. Very important to pay attention to issues of, for example, for your, high context, low context, the power dynamics, that are really embedded in language. How do you read really the different nuances? In French, for example, you have about 5 registers in language. So if you're engaging your counterparts, you're not going to be using the same type of register. Otherwise, you're going to create some serious tensions. So that's how, for example, I, as a linguist and a trainer, cultural and linguistic trainer, I have to be able to navigate these type of spaces in order to help these people who are accustomed to power, and let them understand that Africa is really very complex and nuanced. That in fact, you cannot say, for example, that Africa is homogeneous. Like sometimes you see it in the literature in Heart of Darkness, Africa being the continent of diseases, Africa the continent of conflict, Africa the continent of wars, Africa the continent of every evil that you could imagine. So how can I position myself in order to explain that complexity of Africa beyond the continent? Because Africa is not just the continent, it's also the diaspora. So how can you navigate all these spaces to be able to help, the learner achieve his or her, learning goals? I'll let it here.
Excellent. And Dr. Harrison-Conwill.
Thanks. So when I think about this question of positionality in communities, and I'm also going to try to have the fun of kind of bouncing a little bit off of what some others have said. But first, I think, giving you a sense of how at least I see my role at work will probably help you understand how I'm trying to sort of navigate these spaces, think about translation, and really think about the relationships between me, my teams, and place, and community. So the way that I see my role within, an organization like Google is that I'm tasked with helping teams of technologists, largely, designers, engineers, people who do most of their work at a desk, and imagine the needs of all these people out here, and they're going to build products. My job is making sure that we don't build the wrong thing, or that we're actually building what we intend to, and it actually serves the needs of people. But we're also doing this for large numbers of people. I mean, populations, Google is interested in products that have 1 billion users. So in a lot of ways, I'm trying to influence people about policy and design. And so I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about who's included and who's excluded in the ways that we're thinking about people, the needs that they have, and the things that just are relevant to their lives. I'm also a manager, and so I'm also tasked with enabling other researchers to sort of think about some of the same things. And so, as we do this work, we are thinking about community in a lot of different ways. We might be thinking about things like race, ethnicity, disability, a geographic region. It could be many things, and so we're moving in and out. And so in a lot of ways, I would say that I feel connected to these communities in the ways that many anthropologists probably do in traditional anthropological research, where you may be able to identify with them, you may be able to sort of express those affinities, whether or not they see you as part of that community. It's probably not, but you can find that feeling locally. You can find that in the sort of global research that you do. So in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about my identity as a starting point for thinking about legibility, thinking about inclusion. I feel like this is something I mentioned that I'm sensitive to. So being a Black man in America, the experience of, my educational background going through majority, let's say, white institutions, living in spaces that where I might stand out as one of very few Black people. This is my sort of experience as a Black person in America. And so I think about inclusion, exclusion, and let's say the ways in which people are legible to systems and the consequences for that. But I can't necessarily sort of talk about my identity as something that's going to enable me to do my work, which is really to influence people to make these decisions about a product everywhere. So in a lot of ways, I'm trying to remove myself from the picture in the work that I do. I'm trying to make sure that the people who are going to receive that work, the people who need to make decisions based on it, are not, let's say, viewing my positionality as an obstacle to action. And I work in a space where everyone is sort of obsessed with objectivity, and I am trying to remove myself from the picture as much as I can get away with it in many cases. So like I tend not to work locally. I may do local projects, but I want to pull my team away from a hyper focus on the local when they're building for the world. I am looking for opportunities to say, test ideas, test hypotheses in the world by finding the right populations to test the right things with. And really that means that like I don't have the luxury of, say, doing research in my own backyard and being able to draw on, say, the relationships and the sort of long-term effort that many of us probably had to put in when it came to developing relationships in the field for the traditional ethnographic work that we've done in the past. The tools that I have allow me to move really quickly, but I use incentives. I have to open doors in other ways. And so in a lot of ways, like I think about kindness and rapport, but these are very different things from true sort of, negotiating belonging and the sorts of things that I think that become much more part of the picture when you're doing work that is more local and more long-term in the relationships that you build. The relationships that I build that are long-term are internal to the company because I need those to move. And so I also identify with these groups, but I don't feel I have the luxury to sort of use identity and my connection to, say, communities that like I would spend my time outside of work with, the communities that I live in a lot of the professional work that I do. So it's a very different relationship between kind of community, place, space, and translation.
Someone stuck in comparison. All right, let's move on to the next question, the last question we'll have. What advice do you have for those considering pursuing a career as a practicing anthropologist? What are some tips, things to avoid, what to ask oneself, what to expect, what to avoid, where to search for jobs, how to market oneself? If we could please start with Dr. Rone.
Thank you. So I think you have to figure out what questions really drive you. And for me, it's, so when I finished undergrad, so I actually was a theater major, undergrad theater design. And my plan was to take a little time off and go back and earn an MFA in dramaturgy. And my family said, you'll never get a job. How many dramaturgists do you think there are? But I was interested in context. So that's in some ways similar to anthropology. So I, in between when I was planning to go back to graduate school, or to start graduate school, I started for a bit working in undergraduate admissions at Goucher College, where I had gone to undergrad. And during that time, my territory was from Connecticut through Virginia. And even though I had seen educational disparities in Baltimore, I was struck that no matter where I was, if I was near predominantly African-American or Latinx or pockets of Native American populations in New York, that I would always see more Black and brown children outside on the street corners than I would in these admission sessions when I would go in. And often I would meet children who had just learned about college the week before, when a guidance counselor wanted to make sure there were some people in the room when I showed up the next week. And so that was the turning point for me. And I wanted to know why, what was it about the culture in schools that pushed children out and made the culture outside more engaging? And so that question still drives my work today, whether I'm looking at school absenteeism. I want to know, well, why should we assume? So the familiar is children should want to come to school. So let's make that strange for a second. Why? Why should they want to come to school? Why do you think that all parents know their children should show up for school when they're in kindergarten? Why is that normal? Why do we think literacy is normal? How can we make learning how to read strange for a moment? So I think that it's really sitting with yourself and thinking about the questions that are important and what you want to turn inside out and how you want to empower people. Do you want to drive practice? Do you want to drive policy? Do you want to be able to really take people, work in contexts where people who are not empowered share their ideas and then essentially create a space for those ideas to be shared and to be uplifted and for those people to be empowered and the outcomes or trajectories for those communities to change. So I think finding those, looking inside and thinking about those questions is really important. And then I think, there are all kinds of jobs for anthropologists outside of universities. And often I think it is, it's worth applying to when you see jobs in practice, and it's really marketing your skills in observation, in asking questions, in interviewing, in looking for patterns and discerning patterns that you can use in different ways. Willingness to talk to anybody to try to get an understanding of their lived experience with a process or daily life or whatever it is that you're looking at. So that's the first start.
Let's move on to Dr. Tinguiri.
Thank you very much indeed. As I said initially, I came from multidisciplinary background. So first I studied with African literature and then transitioned to translation studies and linguistics, and I landed into anthropology, and I'm continuing to learn, exploring different fields. So, coming to anthropology, because I was really interested in issues of development, because I'm coming from Burkina Faso, a very poor country in terms of, economic development, of course, but Burkina Faso is very rich in terms of its culture and its people. But I was really interested in development issues because when I was a translator, I had the opportunity to go in the field, helping development actors, for example, translate in, their policies into languages that are really, within the reach of the local, communities that they were trying to help. And I said, well, their job is similar to what I'm doing, at that time. I was doing at that time to be, being a translator. So I decided to continue, later on to embrace anthropology of development at American University, where I finally, completed my, Ph.D. But indeed, I realized that, in fact, once you complete your degree, it's not enough. Having a passion for a topic is not enough. So you have to go beyond that, beyond the walls of the classroom. Being able, for example, to develop connections, is really very important. There is a cliche that your network is your net worth. So you have to go beyond, the classroom, the discipline, being able to establish dialogue between different disciplines. So, and then my interest in art, taught me something that in reality, because I'm coming from a different, background, literature, translation, and linguistic, and then I have anthropology, it's like something that I have on my palette with different colors. How do I mix the colors in order to, to project something, a kind of reality on the canvas that will be palatable to the observer? People who are looking, out there, looking to, for certain type of ideas to consume. Maybe, the palette that you have in your hand with multiple colors, if you mix it properly, you can produce something that's really, consumable. But you cannot do that alone, because, in Burkina Faso, we have a saying that if you go in a city and you say that you know the city, you are in deep trouble. You better know somebody in the city. If you know somebody in the city, that's what is going to save you. It's not just, your intellectual power alone is not going to save you. So yes, beyond indeed the, getting the degree, you have to develop connections and then continue learning. For example, learn, languages, because You cannot be an anthropologist and then not be interested in languages. It's very important to have, at least one language as part of your toolkit, because that will allow you and facilitate communication and the process of translating cultures across the world. And keep on building on your strength, and broaden your perspective. So I'll leave it at that.
Harrison-Conwill?
So in terms of just approaching, say, the job market, I think that anthropologists come, let's say, fresh out of school. You have a lot of tools. And the challenge, at least, speaking for myself and a number of the people who I get to talk to about, let's say, transitioning from this world of academia to at least the world of research and industry. We have all these tools, and very often there's a translation problem. So we've learned all sorts of things about how to understand, and that is extremely valuable. But as Dr. Tangiri also pointed out, you have to continue to add to that toolkit. And I think one of the things that is a big part in making the jump in general is being able to distill all of that complexity, all of that learning that we've been able to do to someone who, for many reasons, probably won't sit there and listen to it if you say it the same way we've been trained to talk about it. So in my space, what that's meant is really taking a moment to think about what you want to do career-wise as a design problem. So I think that this could be, design is goal-oriented. Your goal is to say, what do we need to do? And let's figure out the steps to get there. And of course, there's a lot of room for aesthetic. There's a lot of room for decision-making, but design is also something that comes with constraints. And so it's kind of left up to us in many cases to figure out what those constraints are. And that's gonna really be defined by a lot of different things. It might be the geographic market, it might be the industry, it might be the institutions that you have access to, the cultures of organizations. I am very aware that there are certain places that I probably wouldn't thrive. Those are many places like that have rejected me in the past. Today, I think that those were not bad things at all. It's hard when you're looking to make that sort of a transition to see it the same way, but that's how I see it today. But I really think that we can say, start this goal. Maybe if it's teaching that motivates you, if it's research, if it is some other form of, let's say, enabling action, you can figure out what, let's say, those roles look like, those opportunities look like, what those institutions can see, and start thinking about how do you start to build a narrative? How do you start to put yourself together in a way that they can see you? I am not especially confident that I would be able to go through, let's say, a hiring process as a UX researcher in many places and talk about things in the same way that I learned to talk about them as an anthropologist. The world that I'm in is one where I've had to learn to sort of fit a mold. And part of fitting that mold has meant there's other methods that I needed to add to my toolkit. There are different sets of goals that I had to learn how to approach. One of those being I'm in a space where I need to influence others to action, which means having thoughtful rigorous research. That may not be what opens the doors and gets things to move. In a lot of ways, there's resistance to some of that sort of let's say performance in some institutions. So really, I think that we can use our skills as anthropologists, treat it like field research, understand, let's say, the people, places, artifacts, beliefs that make that system work, and start to put together something that allows you to enter that space. Many of us have done that when just trying to get started in the field. So this is just another exercise. But in terms of titles, I think that is really about, you determining what it is you're looking for and figuring out what people are calling that. So I have spent time looking for jobs as an anthropologist in applied settings. I've found much more opportunity by figuring out that there are a lot of consumer research and a lot of UX research jobs, and I can convince people that I have certain skills that are useful in those spaces, and I've been able to tell that story. And so I think that, just making yourself visible so that you can be sort of understood and therefore sort of placed in a lot of ways is really important. Just using those anthropological skills to break that down for yourself, to create those strategies to essentially, let's say, design whether it's an identity that you're trying to sort of like, whether this is, let's say, passing, whether this is you simply recognizing that there's like something that is closely related to what you believe you are, and you're like, that's close enough for us to be friends. Like you can do all of those sorts of things, but it takes a little bit of, let's say, anthropological inquiry, a little bit of creativity, and problem solving maybe to get there.
Thank you, Dr. Parson. And last but not least, Dr. Leslie.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what everybody has said because I totally agree. But I just want to say that if you look at the history of African-American anthropologists, social scientists, I think you said this in the beginning, we're not an anomaly. We are kind of normal in that, African-Americans have left the academy for many reasons. So it's not something that I don't like, living abroad and then coming back and being reintroduced to this dichotomy between academic and practicing. It's a false dichotomy. It's ridiculous. And I must say that I have done everything legally in my career. And I would say that I think you talked about coming out of the classroom. You have to step out of your comfort zone. And I'm going to tell you this. So when I was living abroad, I had this EU project, and it was about, I helped develop it. And it was about developing a fishing app. I was like, I don't know anything about fish, and I don't know anything about app development. But in working with the app developer and doing the user experience and the UX design, it was anthropology. The whole idea of talking to people and interacting with people. But I will say, and I always can direct it back to health, because if you talk, I was living in the Caribbean, if you talk about fishing is a fundamental part of the economy. And fish is also, well, it's healthy unless it has, what is it that has? Anyway, I'm not going to think about that. The tuna has too much of it in it. So it's contaminated. Some of it is a little bit contaminated, but it's also about building the local economy, which makes people healthier. So I've always gone in it through this lens of health. And I'm going to be honest with you. I went to public health because public health was doing, anthropology was talking. That's what I was finding. Anthropology was sitting, writing to each other, using these huge words that nobody even knows, not even me. And when I went to the Navy for Naval Medical Research Center, I was criticized. Well, how are you going to work with the military? But you know what? When I was at the military, I found out where all the African-Americans, the smart African-Americans are, with PhDs, with MDs. I was amazed. A great group of people. I learned a little bit of virology. I also learned that I don't like the lab. But that gave me the ability by talking to immunologists and working besides them to explain immunological concepts very simply to regular people. So I would say do everything, step outside of your comfort zone, learn, and I have never gotten a job by applying for it. Not saying that I haven't applied for jobs. That's a very good practice to learn how to interview. I've always gotten a job by networking. So you said network is your net worth. Network, work hard, and step outside your comfort zone. That would be my recommendation. I guess I am successful. I don't know, but that's what I have done, and I do feel it has paid off.
Yes, indeed. I just wanted to add a little bit, regarding, for example, translation network into everything. This is something really central. And as an immigrant, when I got here in the United States, I have to translate culture every day. So in my everyday life, I'm translating culture. I'm translating signs. I'm translating faces. I'm trying to read faces and so on and so forth. So when I'm, for example, teaching language and culture, one of the things that I noticed and how anthropology has been very helpful and useful is instructional design. How do you design, for example, your course? It's really the user story, because you have to personalize that. You see how anthropology can really be very helpful. That's when I realized that, oh, maybe I have to open, I have to be open-minded and look a little bit at instructional design, and curriculum development, and see how I can enrich myself, because anthropology really helped me a lot to do that. And then I realized that it's also about managing people. So how do you manage people? If you're in management, you will definitely learn anthropology, because it's about how you engage with people. How do you understand them? How do you put yourself in their shoes? How do you communicate with them? How do you develop your cultural awareness, emotional intelligence, and so on and so forth? When you talk about leadership and management, it's all about also people. It's not just about process and then, and technology. It's about the people really at the heart of that. So, in short, it's really, anthropology is everywhere. It all depends on how you're going to mix your colors on your palette in order to be able to, to make it palatable to the consumer, so to speak, or the customer or client. I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Well, we've arrived at the time where we can open up this event to questions. So let's take a look at some of the questions that we have here. I feel like I'm so we have a question from Amanda Concha Holmes. How can other kinds of literacy beyond the unilinear written word be valued? Embodied knowledges in spaces that embrace collective engagement and not just reading. Anybody want to take a?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, Bertin.
Sure, that's fine. How can other kinds of literacy beyond the unilinear written word be valued? Embodied knowledges in spaces that embrace collective engagement and not just reading.
Oh, how can other kinds of...
Mika, our omniscient ethnographer, she dropped the question or the comment in the chat.
I think you have to really be able to just, you just have, without offending anybody, you just have to be able to talk to people. Sometimes you have to be able to talk to people about nothing, don't start hitting them with theory. Take the conversation down to the level, and then you try and bring it up slowly. I think isn't that really what it's all about? Really, people interacting, people. When you talk about community engagement, engaging them, and again, considering them as equal partners, not somebody that you're going to do something to. And that begins with conversation, which is actually a lost art right now. I hear people talking to each other, they're yelling at each other. This is a lot of things we study. It should be anthropology, using I language as opposed to you language, and motivational communication. I mean, this is really anthropology that we have allowed other disciplines to take and put names on, and they're doing what we do. So you just have to kind of go out there and just be an anthropologist, I think. I mean, it's amazing when I'm listening to social worker people and they're talking about motivational, conversation. And I'm like, well, that's just a regular conversation. That's what we naturally do as anthropologists, don't we? So, I mean, there's so many opportunities, especially this is coming from my field in public health, but they've, it's very public health is very professionalized. It's, and there's a movement now away from the epidemiologists and the physicians And they're really looking now, especially after COVID, when, like now all of a sudden, oh my goodness, there are health disparities. It exposed the health disparities that were already there. And really, they don't know what to do. They don't know. You're seeing more literature of what they do is they start a project and then they're like, okay, we don't know how to engage people. And then they bring the social scientists and they're like, fix it. Instead of engaging them from the very beginning. That's the design. You have to design it so that the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, whatever is already in there. The big social science they're turning to is economics, but they're finding that you need more of the cultural, you need more of the social, you need especially the cultural. And that's why I said at the beginning that you can't just, I can't just go into like Sandtown and be like, hey, I just can't do it. It just wouldn't work. They'd think I'm crazy. So but I mean, I probably could do it if I didn't go in saying, I've been in stores and heard people talking and just join their conversation, because that's what anthropologists do. So, I mean, I think that there's so many opportunities out there, and they're very well-paying opportunities. I'm sure Mr. Google could talk about that. There are other opportunities, and we have to embrace this and let people coming up, and even those people who are in academia, know about it. So
that's
Peggy.
Dr. Leslie, okay. Dr. Harrison-Conwill will go ahead. And then Tracy, did you have your hand up too, Dr. Rone?
Yes.
So, Giles and then Tracy.
Thanks. And I'm sorry for cutting you off. I'm waiting next time for everybody else to talk. Sorry. I think I would say that, like, since defending my dissertation, my relationship to the written word has changed vastly. So I think there's one thing. One question is like, is let's say literacy in the way that it was like described, is that really the tool that you should be relying most on all the time? Another is that there's literacy is not a sort of it's not a 1 or a 0. It's not an on or off. There's a continuum. And what I have found is that in a world where you are competing for attention, where everyone is busy, in many ways, the sort of an attempt to precisely communicate your everything, your ideas, in the ways that we might have been taught in a graduate program, that is the best way to get your work ignored in many places. And so one thing that I find that I need to do every day is think about what is the most efficient usage of the written word, because it's hard to get the attention, and attention is lost quickly. And so it really means that I am looking to be as efficient as possible with my writing as I can, or I'm at risk. That's, like when I write lengthy things, that is for other researchers, that is for me, that is for people who are willing to engage in the thought in that way, but that is not the majority of my interactions. But what I do rely on heavily are relationships. That's built by learning not just about people's work, but learning about them. The sort of your network is your net worth, like you're building your network in your work. You are essentially developing that relationship, because there's going to be times where the relationship is tested in the process of doing your work as well. And so given the fact that my job is largely finding needs and pointing out problems, I don't want people to like walk away because they don't want to hear about their wonderful idea not doing so well. The best way for me to influence is to build a relationship, but that also means that there's a lot of knowledge that is just locked up in people. And so when people change teams, got to rebuild relationships. When people leave teams, like a lot of knowledge is lost. Companies, I would say, are generally bad at retaining knowledge, especially the stuff that like everyone, let's say, like the things that people retain well are the things that people want to hear. As a researcher, I need to tell people things that they don't want to hear very often, which means a lot of the things that I need to get out there are really hard to make, let's say, available to people when they really need it most. And so that's done through like you walking through doors. Like you need to be physically present with people at times. Building those relationships, for me, the best place to do it is field research, where I have a bunch of people who've been isolated and move away from an office for a week at a time and spend time with me. So like I'm thinking about research and space and place and just like time and physical contact as tools to build trust, to build credibility, which I need to cash in on, because like there are these moments where you're like your social capital, you need to start writing some checks, and that it's not captured on a page, and so if you neglected that, I think if you were in my role, you wouldn't get very far in the work that you're doing. So you rely heavily on, let's say, embodied knowledge. Like I take people into the field, I have to speak other languages with them. I am, using my body as an instrument in my research. Like, a survey methodologist has the survey. As an ethnographer, there are times where like, this skin is what is helping me not just collect data, but navigate space, help others navigate space, and make it meaningful and intelligible. So, I need to be with people. Writing just doesn't do the job.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to add.
Michel, before
Okay.
you add that, Tracy wanted to add something.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So I wanted to add to address this point relative to K-12 education. And so I think in Baltimore, what we see is that children and families, that there are multiple literacies that are relative to survival and needing to read cultural cues around communication, around verbal communication, around gesture, around what people are wearing, around how people are walking, around how people might ask you something. And so children, and it really is a matter of survival for some members of our community. When I raise the issue of literacy, the challenge for us is that when we look at the national assessment for academic progress for children, for Black children in Baltimore, only 9% read at or above grade level or grade 4. So what we see is that those children are on a trajectory to not finish because they can't read. They cannot read. They don't have access to higher level math courses, because if you can't read, then you have more difficulty solving a word problem. So essentially, although we are a city with 12 to 14 institutions of higher education, many children in our public school district do not stand a chance of entering one of those institutions. So for us, and I should say that overall, the district rate overall, I think is 13% for all children. So it's not as though the white population is doing dramatically better. So, we need to be, for us, we are valuing this, the literacy of the written word, because our children are not able to get jobs. There are companies that want to hire people, and people can't pass a driver's license test. So there are implications for economic development, for workforce development. And until we address issues of literacy, until we address a system where in many cases, we have multiple generations of people who feel disenfranchised by public education. And it just, it's a challenge at the individual level, at the local community level, and also for the city, so.
Yes. Yeah, may I add something quick?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I just wanted to build on what Tracy just mentioned, also Giles, about the necessity, of course, of really putting literacy at the center is really very important because that's undeniable. Now, if you look at, for example, if you're teaching language and culture, you want to look at different ways of learning. Learners come with different styles. Some of them are maybe very good when it's written. Others are more like the spoken words. Some of them are visual. Some of them are, of course, physical learners and so on and so forth. You want to engage all these forms of learning to help, for example, the learner, engage the material that is taught. That's when, for example, instructional design comes into play. Anthropology also will be, at the heart of how, it can be very helpful in designing, learner-centered materials to achieve learning goals. For example, now you go beyond that and engage, for example, other people in other spaces and places beyond the United States where the written word is really at the heart of communication. So in some cultures, when you're writing a lot, people become a little bit suspicious. Why are you so busy writing all the time? What is behind that? Are you trying to do something? So the written word can be sometimes problematic in certain contexts and in other places in the world. So in a world that is increasingly globalized, if you wanted to engage a multicultural team, so there are different ways of looking at the linguistic reality, like for example, high context cultures and the low context culture, where people prefer people to people relationship. You walk down the hall to talk to people to build relationship. Like for example, Giles mentioned, it's really very important to emphasize that. So when you build relationship, through the spoken word, going out and having some coffee, asking about family and so on and so forth. This is the best way, for example, to go beyond, the written word. If you're going to send emails, it's not going to always be, helpful. Maybe you have to pick up the phone or maybe use a, Zoom conference and other type of communication devices in order to be able to be really productive in a global context where people from different cultures have different ways of communicating.
All right, let's move on to another question. We have a question from Dorothy Griffiths. This is to all the panelists. Do you think the expertise of anthropologists is underutilized in state and federal agencies?
Absolutely. I think across the board, what has happened is that we've developed silos and that everybody is working in their independent silo. And there's nobody, and I don't think that's just state and federal agencies, and there's not as much crossover. And anthropologists, I think, really have a chance here to break down these silos, or that's been my experience. Because what they're finding is that working within these silos, it's just not working, and they need people who have a very broad perspective who can pull things together. And I don't think that it's definitely, somebody put in the chat that it's difficult working with communities when your universities have so many levels of bureaucracy that you can't pay community people, but that's in state and federal agencies also. So I can't, I really don't deal with that component of it. But I think that the idea that and I've heard many people say this, not just anthropologists, but more people are realizing that the direction that we've gone in is very high specializations, but no general understanding or no generalists. And I think that anthropology has that ability to bring it together. And I've come to realize that later on, thinking back, and I was like, but you know what, Teresa, you are an anthropologist. Actually, because I've worked outside of anthropology for so long, but I've always had this ability to connect things, and people kept telling me that you have this ability to connect things. And I don't think that's just me. I just think it's my training as an anthropologist. So.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to add a little bit of, like, for example, if you look at anthropology as practiced in many African countries, because of the colonial history of anthropology, anthropology is now really well perceived in many African countries, especially in Francophone Africa, because the colonized anthropologies are the same. They contributed to the destabilization of African societies, and so anthropologists are perceived as suspicious. So most anthropologists, when they return, for example, of their studies, they end up in politics, or maybe they end up in doing, maybe in the Department of Sociology or doing other type of, things. So because there is no Department of Anthropology, for example, in Burkina Faso, I know. So maybe you can find some, Department of Anthropology in some countries like maybe Cameroon, maybe Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, and maybe Ghana and Benin. So Senegal also with Cheikh Anta Diop. But it's very rare, for example, because of the history of anthropology. When I said, for example, that I was doing anthropology, somebody told me, oh, are you now busy digging graves? I said, no, well, I'm not an anthropologist dig graves. So because there is no distinction between cultural anthropologists and archaeologists, I don't know. So people don't understand what an anthropologist is. I have colleagues who call me a historian. They say, oh, Michel is a historian. I say, well, I'm not a historian. So that is the problem, because the masses, I mean people in general don't understand what anthropology is all about. So, we have to figure out a way to sell the discipline and be able to, let the discipline take a different, color, that is palatable to the audience or to people who are not really well aware of the value of the discipline.
Thank you. We're running out of time, and this is a really great question I want to pose to the panel. And this was something that was reposting that Donna Lissa was able to repost from Mika. So on a really practical level, where would folks who don't have experience outside of academia yet would want to build a career as a practicing anthropologist begin? And I also want to add just something small to this as well, because everybody's talking about networking being your net worth. How do you also network in a pandemic?
Zoom. Just like this. This is the new normal.
So I want to add, so LinkedIn, which is a resource that I never really used. I mean, I've been on it, but I started seeing posts about, from business leaders or people in a local community who were trying to support, I don't know, children in STEM or children and its entrepreneurs and problem solving in terms of how can we alter the trajectory of children. And so I started connecting with those individuals. So LinkedIn actually has turned out to be a better resource than I would have anticipated. I think that, and that's been during the pandemic, I should add. I think before the pandemic, finding out, if there are nonprofits or even, in Maryland, we have state commissions on various issues, and on those commissions usually have a mix of nonprofits and universities and other local and state agencies. And those meetings are often public. So I think going to, and even now they're on Zoom, but I think going to and connecting with people who are doing work in an area in which you're interested in, that's the network. And so I think going to those places and getting on those lists is one way to find out what people are doing, and then becoming vocal and contributing to any work that's being developed, I think is one way to just get in the door.
If I could just follow, volunteering, like I think you're saying, Tracy, even volunteering for civic organizations that have something that you're interested in. There's so many of them, but one person leads to another, and it may take time, but then you follow up on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is actually great. And then you attend their meetings. That's why I said Zoom. And you get to, and don't stop interviewing. You never know if somebody will call you and say, hey, I really can't offer you this, but I can offer you that. So you just have to be kind of savvy.
I think this idea is certainly touched on to some degree, but I think one of the questions is, if you are well, I don't know the position that you might be in today. And that could have a pretty major influence on like what seems like a path you want to take. But if you have, let's say, if you are a graduate student, if you are faculty somewhere, I generally have thought about those as like, moments or, moments in your, career where you have some degree of autonomy in the projects that you take on. And I think that there is an opportunity to begin doing work that, the fields that you're interested in, the organizations that you're interested in can see as valuable, so that like you have something to sort of go to them with, where they could just say like, wow, you're doing this thing. That's exactly what we're interested in. Let's talk. It is difficult to find opportunities to, let's say, come in and gain experience on the job with like, say, research and industry. I think in many cases, people are looking for people to have to already kind of fit certain profiles. And so the things that I see people doing that helps them a great deal is, if they are still students, figure out if there is a way for you to start finding opportunities that really are about gaining that experience that someone else can recognize. So if you're a student, can you get an internship? Internships are wonderful because they essentially, your development becomes someone else's job. So you have a boss, you have projects, or you should have projects that they think are meaningful. And hopefully that is an opportunity for you to learn. Someone is invested in your development. And if it goes well, ideally that also turns into a job offer. This is certainly one of the sorts of recruiting pipelines that I see in tech. And so, I love when I get to see things like students that are coming out of social science programs that are new to fields like UX, working with people, gaining some experience, showing that they have skills that can translate, and finding bigger opportunities as a result of that. There's also, opportunities to work with nonprofits. There's opportunities to do this sort of work in the institutions you're in. So for example, I've seen people take on usability work in libraries in order to get experience with design methods so that they can then enter the job market in spite of the fact that they have taken no coursework in design. So I think that it's a good idea to think about, what is within your reach? What do you have the sort of autonomy to decide for yourself? And how do you start building that path and make sure that it is a path that other people can sort of recognize and sort of understand how to make use of? Because ultimately, I think we're, as I pointed out before, like we're trying to make sure that people can read us, can understand how we fit within an organization, which may have like square shaped pegs. And so like, you're trying to figure out if that is a space you want to be in, as much as giving others an opportunity to see that like, oh, they might not know what an anthropologist is, but there's something about these anthropologists that are doing some really good work here, or maybe just this anthropologist. I actually personally have had little interest in trying to sway people on anthropology. I would rather not fight that fight. I would love for people to recognize anthropologists, because I think that the more people recognize that anthropologists are adding value, the easier it is for us to sort of change the cultures in organizations internally. We can shift the way that people think about things. We can shift the way that people talk about things. And I would much rather see that than teach people about, the four fields. And so I don't spend my time that way. I really think about, how do I make sure that I can shine a light on anthropologists or social scientists or others who are really contributing and allowing us to think about things in ways that, are new. I'm looking for new lenses. I want to collaborate with people with new lenses. And I think that you can show that by beginning to sort of make the connections before you're at that moment where you're just like, I need a job, right?
I know we're running out of time, but I want to have Dr. Tinguiri, respond to this question as well.
Yes, and I just wanted to add that you have to learn another language. That's very important because I know the value of languages. Had it not been my ability to speak multiple languages, I would have been really struggling and, probably sinking neck deep into poverty. So you can have a PhD and be very poor. You don't want to have a PhD or a master's degree and embrace poverty. So you have to be very creative and have, ways of mixing your colors. So don't just mix, even if you have one color, you have to figure out a way to, to find, a way to diversify it with different type of matter. You can put a little bit of water in a black color and then have different, hue and, and shades and be able to, paint something that will really catch the eye. So it's all about how you're going to mix your colors. In other words, you have to be open-minded, flexible, and be all the way on the go to learn, in other disciplines. Instructional design, for example, is very important. Curriculum development is very important. Management is very important. Leadership is very important. Of course, you have to learn something about cybersecurity, basic things like that. And also maybe look around like in institutions like maybe the World Bank, IMF, etc. Because I remember I had the opportunity to do what we call, curriculum protocol training at the World Bank for 7 months, which really allowed me to better understand that there were certain opportunities, like for example, teaching languages. Now I ended up in the foreign service, as a contractor. I never heard about that. It's really about how you can go beyond anthropology and explore other, spaces, and don't be afraid, because that's what the real world is about. Thank you.
Excellent. And on that note, I want to thank my esteemed colleagues so much for joining us. Can we get like a round of like cyber applause for them, please? Yes, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank my behind the scenes collaborator who worked with me on getting this event together, Dr. Mika Polanco. And also, yes, he's doing applause as well. And Karen G. Williams, both of them are the organizers of the ABA Always Already series, which is in celebration of our 50th anniversary. So please give them a round of applause as well. Yes. So essentially, I just want to thank everyone for coming, participating in this awesome event. This event will be available on ABA's YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe, and you'll, as soon as like the video is available, you'll be notified about that. And also, please consider paying attention to your, getting on the ABA listserv as well to find out about more of these events. We try to publicize them through social media and the ABA listserv, but also join the ABA listserv as well. And just be sure that to be aware of like the next upcoming events. We'll have another event that will be happening, I believe, in the following month. It's going to take place every last Thursday of every month from now until November. And November is when we are planning to meet in Baltimore at the AAAS. So yes, so I want to thank everyone again for coming. I appreciate everyone, and everyone enjoy their evening. Thanks again to our guests and all the organizers and everyone else. Everyone take care. Bye-bye now.